The city was still half asleep when Adrian stepped out of his apartment, coffee in hand, scarf loosely wrapped around his neck. The streets hummed with the same familiar rhythm, distant horns, hurried footsteps, the soft groan of buses starting their routes. For most people, mornings were a blur of routine, but for Adrian, this ritual carried a quiet thrill. Every dawn led him to the same corner, the same bus stop, and to him, Marco, the driver who unknowingly held his heart hostage. It wasn't just about getting to work. It was about those fleeting glances that made the day worth living. Inside the bus, the air was a blend of diesel and morning chill. Adrian always chose the same seat, 3 rows back, left side, where he could see Marco's reflection in the rearview mirror. The way Marco's hands moved across the steering wheel fascinated him, confident, steady, almost protective. He'd pretend to scroll through his phone, but really, his gaze lingered just long enough to memorize those subtle details, the curve of Marco's smile, the deep timbre of his voice when he greeted passengers. Little moments, but to Adrian, they meant everything. And in those moments, time seemed to stretch, the hum of the engine fading into the rhythm of his heartbeat. There was something magnetic about the way Marco's eyes occasionally caught his through the mirror. It wasn't flirtation, not yet. It was something quieter, something that built slowly, day after day, a connection made of glances and unspoken words. Adrian didn't know if Marco ever noticed, but that didn't matter. The anticipation itself had become his addiction, a secret reason to wake up each morning with hope fluttering beneath his ribs. Adrian's mornings had turned into a quiet performance, a mix of courage and restraint. He'd rehearse small talk in his head while waiting at the stop, pretending not to notice when the bus turned the corner. The hiss of the doors opening always made his chest tighten. Marco would nod, offer that calm, dependable smile, and Adrian would step aboard like a man entering a dream he wasn't supposed to have. Every movement mattered. The brush of fingers passing a ticket, the short exchange of "good morning." To anyone else, it was nothing, but to Adrian, it was everything. He began to memorize Marco's habits, the soft hum he made when concentrating, the classic rock station he always tuned into, the way he adjusted the mirror before pulling out of the terminal. Adrian caught himself thinking about these things at work, drifting through spreadsheets while picturing Marco's profile against the morning light. It scared him a little, how much space this man had begun to occupy in his thoughts. But there was also comfort in it, like a song he couldn't stop humming, familiar and dangerously soothing. Sometimes, as the city rolled past outside, Adrian wondered what Marco's life was like beyond the wheel. Did he go home to someone? Did he live alone, in quiet simplicity, like him? Those questions lingered like fog on the window. The truth was, he didn't want to know yet. Fantasy was safer than reality. Still, something inside him whispered that this story was moving, slowly, yes, but inevitably, toward a turn he couldn't avoid. That Friday morning, the city felt different, lighter somehow, as if the air itself carried a secret. Adrian noticed the way sunlight spilled through the bus windows, casting warm streaks across Marco's shoulders. It was silly, he knew, but those small details had become his morning poetry. He clutched his coffee cup like armor, his pulse steadying only when Marco's voice filled the cabin. There was a safety in that voice, something grounding, something that made the rest of the world blur into background noise. For a few precious minutes, Adrian wasn't just another commuter. He was part of something quietly beautiful. As the bus rolled down the familiar avenue, Marco glanced in the rearview mirror, and this time, he didn't look away so quickly. That moment stretched, delicate and electric. Adrian froze, unsure if he should smile or pretend he hadn't noticed, but his lips betrayed him, curving into a small, shy grin. Marco's eyes softened, almost like a silent acknowledgement, and though no words were spoken, something shifted. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken meaning. It wasn't a conversation, it was recognition. When Adrian stepped off the bus that morning, he felt the world spinning differently. His feet hit the pavement, but his thoughts stayed behind, still lingering in that bus seat, still echoing with the sound of Marco's quiet hum. Maybe it was just imagination, or maybe, just maybe, something had begun. The city continued its usual rush, unaware that two strangers had just crossed a line neither could name yet. And tomorrow, when the bus doors opened again, everything might feel just a little less ordinary. Marco had driven this route for nearly a decade, yet lately, something about it felt different. The faces were the same, sleepy commuters clutching coffee cups, scrolling through phones, but there was one face he'd started to notice more than the rest. The man from 3 rows back. The quiet one with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. Marco didn't know his name yet, but he knew the way that man looked at the morning, with a mix of hope and longing that tugged at something deep inside him. It wasn't usual for Marco to wonder about passengers, but this one lingered in his thoughts long after the route ended. There was a steadiness in Marco's life that bordered on isolation. He woke before dawn, made his rounds, and returned to a small apartment that was more functional than warm. Routine had become his armor. It protected him from disappointments, from the chaos of emotions he'd long learned to keep buried. But now, he found himself waiting, almost anticipating, that moment when the quiet man would board. Sometimes he'd catch himself checking the mirror just to see if he'd arrived. He told himself it was harmless curiosity. He knew better. Adrian, yes. He'd learned the name from a coworker one morning, carried an energy that unsettled Marco's calm. Not loud, not dramatic, just alive. He laughed softly when the bus hit a bump, smiled at elderly passengers, always thanked him at the end of the ride. Small things, but to Marco, those gestures started to feel personal, and that scared him a little, because he wasn't supposed to notice. Not like this. Not when the line between driver and passenger was so clear, or at least, it used to be. Marco began noticing details he'd never cared about before. The faint scent of cologne that lingered after Adrian passed, the rhythm of his footsteps approaching the bus, the way his laughter slipped through the usual drone of morning chatter. It was subtle, disarming, almost dangerous. He tried to shake it off, to focus on the road, on schedules, on keeping everything professional, but every time their eyes met in the mirror, something inside him stuttered. It wasn't lust, not entirely. It was something slower, heavier, like a tide creeping closer with each passing day. He found himself thinking about Adrian outside of work. At stoplights, he'd catch his mind wandering, imagining the kind of life Adrian led, what music he listened to, whether he ever felt as lonely as Marco did when the city went quiet at night. Those thoughts unsettled him. They cracked open parts of himself he thought had long gone dormant. Marco wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. He'd built his world on silence and control, but Adrian's presence had a way of slipping past both. It was maddening and oddly comforting all at once. Then came the morning Adrian brought him coffee. A simple paper cup, warm and unexpected. "Thought you could use one," Adrian said, his voice soft but confident. Marco froze, torn between gratitude and alarm. He thanked him, of course, but the warmth of that gesture followed him through every turn of the wheel. He could still feel it hours later, the lingering sweetness of something that felt like the beginning of trouble, or maybe the beginning of something he'd been waiting for without even knowing it. Days began to blur into each other, yet Marco noticed every small change in Adrian's behavior. The way he lingered near the front when the bus wasn't crowded, the slight hesitation before stepping off, as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Marco found himself waiting for those moments, searching for them, almost craving them. It scared him, how something so simple, a shared glance, a smile, could unsteady a man who prided himself on control. He'd built a life around predictability, but Adrian was quietly rewriting his rules, one morning at a time. Sometimes, when traffic slowed to a crawl, Marco would steal a glance in the mirror, pretending to check the road behind him, but what he really looked for was that familiar figure, sitting 3 rows back, lost in thought. Adrian had a softness about him, a calm energy that disarmed Marco's guarded nature, and beneath that calm, Marco sensed something else, a quiet yearning that mirrored his own. It was unnerving, but also magnetic. For the first time in years, he caught himself wondering, what if he didn't fight it? That thought lingered long after his shift ended. As the depot lights dimmed and the city exhaled into night, Marco sat alone behind the wheel, tracing the faint outline of the steering wheel with his thumb. He wasn't sure what he wanted, or maybe he was, but didn't dare name it yet. All he knew was that something was shifting between them, slowly, silently, like the city before dawn. And somewhere deep inside, Marco realized he no longer wanted the road to stay the same. The first time Adrian left the note, his hands trembled. It wasn't anything bold, just a small, folded piece of paper tucked near the dashboard when no one was watching. "Thank you for making my mornings better." Simple, safe. But as he stepped off the bus, his heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the city noise. For hours afterward, he wondered if Marco would find it, if he'd smile, if he'd guess who left it. And the next morning, When Marco greeted him with an almost imperceptible grin, Adrian knew he'd found it. He knew. From then on, things felt different. There was a new rhythm in their routine, subtle but alive. Sometimes Marco played music Adrian liked. Other times, Adrian lingered after everyone had left, pretending to adjust his coat just to steal another minute of conversation. They talked about small things, the weather, the traffic, a broken air conditioner, but beneath those words was something heavier, unsaid, a current neither could ignore. The tension between them grew not from what they said, but from everything they didn't. Marco tried to stay professional, tried to keep the distance that duty demanded, but each day, that invisible line blurred a little more. Adrian's laughter lingered in the air like the last note of a favorite song. His gaze, open and earnest, disarmed the walls Marco had built. One morning, when Adrian's hand brushed his while handing him change, the contact was brief, a spark, accidental, yet deliberate in its effect. Both men froze, caught in that second that seemed to stretch forever, and in silence, something undeniable began to take shape. The next few days unfolded like a careful dance, neither man leading, neither daring to step too far. Marco found himself waiting for Adrian's stop, glancing toward the mirror just to catch that familiar smile. He told himself it was harmless, but he knew better. Every look carried weight now. Every word seemed to hover a little too long in the air, and yet he couldn't stop. When Adrian wasn't there one morning, an ache bloomed quietly in his chest. He didn't want to name it. Longing sounded too dangerous, too real, but that's what it was. When Adrian returned the next day, the relief Marco felt was almost embarrassing. He tried to hide it behind a casual nod, but Adrian saw it. He always did. This time, he stayed after everyone else had gone, standing near the front as the bus idled at its last stop. The city outside was soft with rain, streetlights flickering across the windshield like fleeting thoughts. They talked quietly about favorite places, music, small dreams. Marco found himself smiling more than he had in years, caught off guard by how natural it felt. Then, for just a moment, silence filled the space between them. Not awkward, not heavy, just charged. The kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. Marco's fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel. Adrian shifted closer, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the rain. Their eyes met, steady this time. There was no hiding, no pretending. And in that stillness, the world outside seemed to fade until all that existed was them, two men teetering on the edge of something neither could yet define. That evening, the rain refused to stop. It painted silver streaks across the windshield as the bus rattled down its nearly empty route. Marco's hands tightened around the wheel, his focus blurring between the road ahead and the reflection in his mirror. Adrian's eyes, calm but unyielding, watching him with a kind of quiet courage. The world outside was a storm, but inside the bus, the air was thick with a different kind of electricity. Marco felt it hum beneath his skin. That pull, that question, that dangerous invitation lingering in every heartbeat. When the last passenger stepped off, Adrian stayed seated, pretending to look out the window. The sound of the closing doors echoed through the empty aisle. Marco didn't tell him to leave. Instead, he parked at the terminal, the engine still humming softly. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the rain did, tapping on the glass like a heartbeat trying to keep pace. Then Adrian rose, slowly, walking toward the front. Every step felt deliberate, inevitable. When he stopped near Marco's seat, his voice came out as a whisper. "Do you ever get tired of the same road?" Marco turned, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. No mirror, no reflection, just truth. His answer wasn't immediate. It came in the form of a small, breathless laugh and the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it's time for a new one." The sentence hung in the air, fragile and full of promise. And in that moment, both men knew the road they'd been traveling was about to change. Not by chance, but by choice. The depot after midnight had its own kind of silence, not empty, but alive with echoes. The sound of dripping rain, the low hum of engines cooling down, the faint glimmer of city lights spilling through the glass. Marco had parked the bus in its corner bay, far from the others, the world outside fading into shadows. Adrian stood a few steps away, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, unsure whether to speak or breathe. It was strange. The place that had always felt routine now felt sacred, charged with the weight of what might come next. Marco sat behind the wheel, staring ahead at nothing. His pulse thudded with the same rhythm as the engine's last breaths. He could have said something to break the tension, a joke, a warning, anything, but words felt too small. He'd spent his life following routes, obeying schedules, keeping everything neatly within the lines, but Adrian's presence had drawn him off course, and for once, he didn't want to find his way back. He turned toward him, the flicker of the streetlight catching the softness in his eyes. "You didn't have to wait," he said quietly. "I wanted to," Adrian replied, voice low but steady. There was no hesitation, no disguise left between them. The distance that had once felt impossible now narrowed to a single breath. Marco's heart pounded, not with fear, but recognition. This wasn't an accident. It was the arrival of something long delayed, something neither of them had words for. Outside, thunder rolled distantly. Inside, everything felt still, like the world had paused just long enough for them to finally exist, not as driver and passenger, but as two men standing exactly where they needed to be. The air inside the bus was thick with warmth and quiet anticipation. The scent of rain clung to their clothes, mingling with the faint traces of coffee and diesel, an oddly intimate perfume that belonged only to this night. Marco rose from his seat slowly, as though afraid any sudden movement might break the fragile spell between them. Adrian didn't move away. Their eyes met in the dim light, searching, questioning, confessing without words. The city outside had vanished. It was just them now, suspended in a moment that felt both endless and inevitable. For the first time, Marco saw Adrian not as the shy commuter he'd watched from the mirror, but as someone who had been silently waiting for him too. Every smile, every note, every good morning had led to this. Two paths finally crossing in the space where rules no longer mattered. Marco's hand hesitated before reaching out, fingertips grazing Adrian's wrist. It wasn't bold, not yet, just a quiet test of reality. Adrian didn't pull away. He leaned closer, breath catching, eyes locked. The bus, once a cage of routine, had become something else entirely, a vessel of possibility. Words felt useless. What existed between them was older than speech, deeper than explanation. Marco exhaled, the sound trembling slightly, and the tension that had built for weeks melted into something gentler, a recognition, a surrender. "I didn't plan any of this," he murmured. Adrian smiled, small and real. "Maybe that's the point." Their laughter, soft, nervous, disbelieving, filled the space where silence had once lived. Outside, the rain began to fade, as if even the storm was giving them permission to begin. The rain slowed to a whisper against the windows, and for the first time all night, the city seemed to exhale. Inside the bus, light pooled softly from the dashboard, painting them both in a glow that felt more like moonlight than electricity. Marco leaned back against the driver's seat, and Adrian stood before him, their breaths sinking, the silence between them humming like a secret chord. Everything that had been restrained, every stolen glance, every careful word, now surfaced as a quiet flood of feeling neither man tried to contain anymore. Adrian took a small step closer, the kind that felt monumental in its simplicity. Marco's hand rose again, this time steadier, resting lightly on Adrian's arm. There was no rush, no hunger for what came next, only a profound stillness, a mutual understanding that this was something real, fragile, and rare. The walls that had separated them, the uniform, the seat, the daily routine, no longer meant anything. All that mattered was that, here in this forgotten hour, they had both chosen to stay. When their eyes met again, it wasn't about confession or courage, it was about arrival. Two men who had circled each other for months had finally found a place where neither had to pretend. Marco smiled, softer than Adrian had ever seen. "You know," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "I think I've been waiting for this stop for a long time." Adrian's answering smile said everything words couldn't. The engine ticked quietly, the city began to stir again in the distance, and just like that, the bus that once carried strangers now held the beginning of something entirely new. Morning arrived slower than usual, filtered through soft gray clouds that hung over the city like a half-kept secret. Marco woke before the alarm, the familiar hum of traffic in the distance grounding him back into reality. For a fleeting second, he wondered if the night before had been a dream, something imagined, conjured by exhaustion and longing. But then he saw the faint trace of Adrian's scent on his jacket, the memory of his laugh still echoing quietly in his chest. It had happened. It was real, and the thought filled him with both warmth and uncertainty. Adrian, meanwhile, moved through his tiny kitchen in a haze of disbelief. The morning felt foreign, as though he'd stepped into a world slightly tilted on its axis. The bus route, the routine, all of it would still be there, waiting. But he wasn't the same man who had ridden that bus every morning, quietly admiring from a distance. Something had shifted inside him, a mixture of peace and fear, of joy tangled with what comes next. He poured his coffee, hands trembling, heart full of questions he wasn't ready to ask. Both men, miles apart in their separate homes, carried the same thought. What now? The night had rewritten the rules they'd lived by, and morning had arrived with its quiet reckoning. The city, indifferent and endless, carried on as usual, but for them, every sound, every turn, every beam of light felt altered. They had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back. But maybe that was the point. Maybe not all routes are meant to return to where they began. Adrian reached the bus stop early that morning, his nerves a jumble of excitement and fear. The air was crisp, the streets still damp from last night's rain. He kept glancing down the road, heart jumping at every approaching engine. Would Marco act the same? Would he smile the way he always did? Or would everything feel different now? The sound of the familiar bus finally cut through the morning noise, and for a moment, Adrian thought of turning away. But when the doors opened and he saw Marco's eyes, steady, warm, unmistakably knowing, the hesitation dissolved. Marco greeted him softly, the same words as always, yet they carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Morning? Just that. But it was enough. The bus was half empty, sunlight slanting through the windows in golden streaks. Adrian took his usual seat, 3 rows back, though both of them knew nothing about this felt usual anymore. As the bus moved, their gazes met through the rearview mirror, and this time, neither looked away. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was a shared understanding, a quiet promise hidden in plain sight. For the rest of the ride, neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The city outside rolled by, office towers, bakeries opening, children in school uniforms, all the small rituals of morning life continuing as though nothing had changed. But inside that bus, everything had. Marco's reflection lingered in the mirror, his smile a fraction softer, his shoulders a little lighter, and Adrian felt it too, that strange, beautiful comfort that comes when the impossible finally becomes real, even if just for now. The days that followed unfolded like the beginning of a quiet secret, one shared not in whispers, but in glances and small gestures only they could read. A nod here, a half smile there, a pause that lingered just long enough to remind them of what had changed. They didn't talk about that night, not yet. Some things didn't need words to exist. What they had wasn't loud or dramatic. It was tender, patient, the kind of connection that existed between the lines of ordinary life. Each morning ride became its own story, familiar yet transformed, full of promise disguised as routine. For Marco, the world outside the windshield seemed softer now. He still drove the same streets, stopped at the same corners, followed the same signals, but every reflection in his mirror held more meaning. Every sunrise felt a little more alive. For Adrian, each step onto the bus felt like coming home, not to a place, but to a person. He didn't know what the future held, and maybe that was okay. Sometimes, happiness wasn't about certainty. It was about choosing to stay on the road, together, for as long as the journey allowed. One morning, as the bus slowed at Adrian's stop, he hesitated before leaving. He turned toward Marco, eyes bright, and said simply, "See you tomorrow." It was the same phrase he'd said 100 times before, but this time, it sounded like a promise. Marco's smile reached his eyes as he answered, "You'd better." The doors closed, the engine rumbled to life, and the city swallowed the bus once more. But inside that small, moving world, something lasting had begun. A new route, uncharted, but theirs all the same.